Hi, Massimo.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video on the Meaning of Life.tv platform and via audio podcast. You are Massimo, I want to say Pigliucci? Is that
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Is that pretty good?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And you are a professor of philosophy at City College in New York. Is this true?
That's correct.
And you are the author of, among various books, How to Be a Stoic. I think it's fair to call you a leader of the Stoic revival, if that's the term. Are you using the term Stoic revival?
No, but that's a good idea.
You should.
That's actually, the term mostly uses modern Stoicism or movement, but revival, I like that. Yeah,
I think you should declare yourself the unrivaled leader of the Stoic revival.
That would be rather pretentious of me, and therefore non-Stoic.
One thing a lot of people who have achieved great things in life have in common is that they are pretentious. You may have noticed this.
Yeah, I was just reading for a book that I'm working on now about Alexander the Great.
Hey,
and, talk about example. Pretentious, right?
Not overflowing with humility, and look where he got. He got killed. But anyway, so today we're not going to talk about Stoicism.
Nope.
We're going to talk about whether evolution could have a higher purpose. That's one way of putting it. Maybe we'll get to the question of whether there's any evidence that it does, but that would, I guess, presume that you accept the idea that it could, and I'm not sure you accept that idea. The way this started is I wrote a piece for the New York Times years ago called "Could Evolution Have a Higher Purpose?" And I started it with, let me just say, first of all, you replied to that with a skeptical piece. And so before I kind of get into how I tried to illustrate the question in that New York Times piece, why don't you tell us how skeptical are you of the idea that evolution, that there could be some larger purpose unfolding through evolution?
Yeah.
Through evolution by natural selection, just kind of conventional evolution. We're not talking about intelligent design. At least I don't mean to be. We're not talking about spooky immaterial forces guiding evolution. Do you accept my claim that it could be that just nuts and bolts evolution by natural selection could in some sense be serving a larger purpose? Right.
So yes and no, and here's the thing. So as you know, my background, before I moved to philosophy, actually my background was in evolutionary biology, particularly gene-environment interactions. And it depends on what you mean, because it's not reasonable for me to, or for any scientist, I think, to reject a logical possibility a priori, right? What you're talking is a logical possibility. I mean, it's certainly, there are logical scenarios under which, sure, that could be the case. So the question really comes down to evidence, right? Do we have any reasons other than the possibility of a logical scenario to entertain seriously the notion that evolution might have a higher purpose? And if you put it that way, in terms of empirical evidence, then I tend to be very skeptical. But, I'm open to be convinced otherwise, and that's why we're having this discussion, I suppose.
Okay. Well, maybe we should dwell for a little while on the very question of whether it's even logically possible that evolution could have a purpose, because I think some people do get hung up there.
Yeah.
The illustration I used in the New York Times piece, I dug up some footage of me interviewing William Hamilton in the 1990s. Now, Hamilton, who's no longer alive, was, I think you'd agree, one of the biggest names of the 20th century in evolutionary biology.
Oh, yes, easily.
The name most prominently associated with kin selection, which is the dynamic by which we think altruism among close relatives evolved. He's very creative, interesting guy. And I was videoing him. And in fact, the guy with me doing it was the now famous documentary maker, Alex Gibney. And I mean, nothing ever came of this footage in the way of an actual documentary. I think Alex wisely figured the further away he was from me, the more likely he'd be to actually get documentaries finished. But But Hamilton, he went off on this thing. I mean, I think I said, have you ever thought about the possibility that evolution has a purpose or something? And he didn't need any more prompting. You know, and I think maybe I used the term transcendental purpose. I'm not sure. But he said, you know, it's funny. I've often entertained the idea, kind of half jokingly, but that we're a zoo. We on planet Earth are a zoo for the amusement of extraterrestrials. The idea seemed to be they had come down and planted the seed of natural selection, you know, this primordial, whatever it was, strand of RNA, DNA, whatever, that then evolves into the whole ecosystem. Now, in his scenario, he wondered, like, you know, maybe they intervene every once in a while, these extraterrestrials, and that could explain miracles or something. But let's forget that part. Just for purposes of the thought experiment, let's assume that these extraterrestrials are more analogous to a deistic kind of God, the kind of God conceived by deists. In other words, an intelligent being that sets the thing in motion and then keeps its hands off.
Right.
And the point I was making was, we can't rule out that could be true. And if it's true, then evolution by natural selection would have a larger purpose. In other words, there's something the aliens had in mind. They whether they wanted a zoo or whatever else, there was something that natural selection was kind of designed to unfold toward, okay? So, and I said, look, it's William Hamilton. He's obviously talking about nuts and bolts materialistic natural selection.
Right.
So there you go. There could be an evolution with a purpose that's just regular materialist evolution.
Correct. And so that scenario, which, by the way, is an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's based on that, on that kind of scenario. And it's also, as you probably know, a scenario that has been often actually, well, maybe not often, but sometimes has actually been invoked as an explanation for why we haven't had contact with extraterrestrial intelligence yet, even though they allegedly are all over the place. And, you know, the zoo scenario is one of the possibilities. It's like, you know, with this kind of ongoing experiment, and they don't want to mess around with the ongoing experiment. Now, and in fact, we don't even need to talk about gods or deism in that context. I mean, this is just a very advanced civilization. It's true that Arthur C. Clarke famously said that a sufficiently advanced civilization will look like a deity to us. Fine. But really, we're not talking about anything supernatural. We're just talking about something that could happen. And so that's what I meant when I said, you know, if you're asking me in terms of logical possibility, I would say, yeah, sure, that it could be. However, at least from where I sit at the moment, I see no reason whatsoever to actually entertain the possibility as a matter of, you know, scientific hypothesis that I can do something about, because I don't see any evidence of that sort of scenario being actually the case. And one of the reasons I insist on this difference between, of course, the logical possibility, the logical scenarios on the one hand, and so the empirical scientific ones on the other, is because ever since I moved into philosophy, one of the things that occasionally irritates me is these a lot of metaphysicians who seem to think, not all of them, but a lot of metaphysicians who seem to think that just because something is conceivable, in other words, it's kind of logically consistent, therefore it's something that we should really seriously entertain and talk about. For instance, David Chalmers and his famous zombies when it comes to the nature of consciousness. And I want to say no. Because the number of things that are conceivable is literally infinite. It's like you could conceive an infinite number of things. I mean, if you're talking about anything that is logically consistent, well, the number of things that are logically consistent is essentially infinite. And we're never going to get anywhere if we're going to start talking about an infinite number of possibilities. That is the major difference between, you know, speculation on the one hand and science on the other. So it was interesting to see that in your article that Hamilton actually entertained that possibility. He did say in that interview that he was half joking. Now I wonder how much of a half joke that actually was. I mean, we all occasionally get into that kind of mood where we speculate and we entertain these kind of possibilities. I mean, another one that I think you mentioned in that article, and that actually is being taken somewhat seriously by some philosophers recently is the simulation hypothesis, right?
Right. Very closely related to this question,
right,
I think.
Right. In that case, we're really talking about something that is even closer to a god, because we're talking about a simulator or a race of simulators that are, for all effective purposes, outside of our universe. I mean, at least the extraterrestrials that you mentioned earlier are part of our physical universe. The simulators are actually building this entire universe. The what we call the laws of nature are, in fact, the parameters of the simulation and all that sort of stuff. Now, again, is it a logical possibility? Sure. Meaning that it doesn't entail any logical contradiction. That scenario doesn't entail any logical contradiction. But that's a very low bar. A lot of stuff doesn't entail logical contradictions. Do I have any reason, however, to believe that we actually live in a simulation? Pace, my colleague, Nick Bostrom, no, I don't think so. Simply because there is no empirical evidence that is the case.
Yeah, I agree that the fact that it's a logical possibility is not the highest bar you'd have to pass to take the hypothesis really seriously. On the other hand, the reason I wanted to dwell on it is because a lot of people seem not to realize it is a logical possibility. In other words, if you say, I think maybe evolution, there's some larger purpose unfolding through evolution, they say, but I thought you were a Darwinian. You wrote, and they think there's like an inherent contradiction. There's not. In fact, I don't think Darwin in the end did believe in a God, and maybe it was more for public relations purposes that he, was willing to play around with hypotheses, with scenarios suggested by theologians of the day who were trying to reconcile Darwinism with theology, who talked about a creator who had created life by, in the way Hamilton's talking about. So it is a logical possibility. We agree on that. But before we get into the question of whether there's evidence of it or what evidence would look like, I do think there are a lot of things that are not readily testable scientific hypotheses that are worth talking about. Especially, the more profound questions like free will. That's important. You're not going to come up, I don't think, with a definitive scientific test of the hypothesis of free will. And I would say the same thing about various theories about what consciousness is. I think that by its nature is not susceptible to scientific evaluation in the way that a lot of hypotheses are. I still think they're worth talking about.
Yeah. But let me qualify that from my perspective. So I agree, contra some of my science colleagues, for instance, that there are questions that can't be settled by scientific evidence. Either cannot be settled now by scientific evidence, or maybe even in principle can be settled by scientific evidence. So I am not what sometimes I don't endorse the position that sometimes is referred to as scientistic, or scientism. That this notion that the only meaningful questions are questions that can be answered scientifically. However, the big caveat that I put there, and this look may simply be a reflection of my dual career, as a scientist on the one hand and a philosopher on the other hand. So I am attracted both to the empirical evidence, obviously, as a scientist, but also to the more speculative aspect. That's why I moved to philosophy. However, I want to keep those two in talking to each other in visual distance from each other. There was an influential philosopher of the middle part of the 20th century, W.V.O. Quine, who famously said that we want to maintain our ontologies as sparse as possible. In other words, we don't want to come up with a number of possible scenarios for which there is no particular reason to believe in. Just keep it as simple as possible. Entertain all the speculations you want, but then at the end of the day, remain as much metaphysics ought to remain as much in contact with science as possible. For instance, let me take your own example of free will. I am what people call a compatibilist about free will, right? Which is the dominant position in philosophy nowadays.
Sadly, yes, but go ahead.
I know. Well, let's not get there. That's a whole different discussion.
We should say it's the idea that free will and determinism are actually compatible. Who knew?
Correct.
Is that a fair way to summarize what it means?
That's right. Depending, because it hinges, of course, on how exactly you conceive free will, right? Compatibilists agree with hard determinists that free will doesn't mean that free will is actually a misnomer, that we shouldn't be talking about free will. We should be talking about volition, the ability of human beings to make decisions, because there's nothing free about it, right? It's not disconnected from the laws of nature. Now, I think it's fair to say that the difference between compatibilism and hard determinism is not one of substance. It's one of how you think about human decision making.
I agree.
Because otherwise the facts are the same. Now, on the other hand, the position that I think we both reject pretty clearly is the libertarian position, and I'm not talking about the politics.
I'm actually an agnostic on free will. I don't reject it. I just think it's beyond reckoning, so far as I can tell.
Well, then let me say that I actually do reject the libertarian position. Again, not the political one,
right?
Although I have problems there.
But free
as well.
will in the traditional sense that your volition is in some sense not entirely bound by the laws of physics, of science, and so on. That it truly, it is not inevitable what you will do tomorrow, and you could not predict it even if you knew everything. Even if you were this, omniscient being that knew everything about all causal forces at play, you could still not predict it even in principle.
Correct. So now why do I reject libertarian free will? Because I want to keep my ontological positions, my metaphysical position, and free will certainly is a metaphysical question, as close as possible to the empirical science. And the libertarian has to make this gigantic leap and saying that somehow there are exceptions to the laws of cause and effect. And while another term for those exceptions are miracles, and I don't believe in miracles. And the reason I don't believe in miracles, again, is because it's a tall order. It's what Carl Sagan would call an extraordinary claim, and therefore it requires extraordinary evidence, and I see no evidence of it. So, while I agree with you, the only reason I brought all these things up is because on the one hand, I agree with you that there certainly are questions that cannot be settled by the empirical evidence as it stands, and perhaps even as it will stand in the future. However, I guess my skepticism is proportional to how far I see a particular idea going from the available empirical evidence. In other words, good philosophy, I think, has to be informed and tethered to some extent by good science. Otherwise, we're just going to talk about whatever we want to talk about, but with no limitations, with no way to tell anything that might possibly be true from something that is an entire flight of fancy.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, to return to the question of consciousness, in other words, the fact that it is like something to be alive, the fact that there is subjective experience, that seems to me a question that is, on the one hand, obviously important. I mean, after all, the reason we can feel pleasure and pain and joy and everything else is, I would say, the reason life has meaning. I mean, to get back to the zombie thought experiment, if you imagine beings that behaved exactly like us had no interior life, you'd say, well, that's not a meaningful life, probably, right? And it doesn't even matter much if you kill one of them because they're not capable of experience anyway. So on the one hand, it's a very important question. But on the other hand, it seems to me almost inherently not amenable ultimately to scientific analysis because subjective experience cannot be observed by more than one being, and whenever there's going to be a truly scientific test of a hypothesis, the evidence generated by the test has to be publicly observable. There has to be more than one person who can look at the evidence. This is the temperature that was reached, or this is what the molecule looked like at the end of the experiment, or whatever. Whereas with subjective experience, no one but me can share my subjective experience. So there is some sense in which, I don't know if you want to call it data, but there, that experience, but there's some sense in which the data is not publicly observable. So it can't be.
That is the argument, but I'm not sure that I buy it. I mean, not that we want to necessarily make the conversation all about consciousness and stuff, but, for one thing, there is such a thing as self-reported, experience, which we accept in other areas of psychological research. There is research, for instance, on happiness, and that is research on self-reported happiness, not on of things that you can measure with, like atoms and molecules.
We accept it because it's the best we've got.
Well, right. I agree. I agree.
Not because it's not flawed, and not because it is happiness.
Completely agree. So what psychologists do is they hypothesize that there is a quantity underlying these subjective reports that quantity correlate with these reports, and they're trying to sort of triangulate, basically what they're assuming an hidden variable, essentially. And that's a standard way of doing things not only actually in psychology and in sociology, but even in certain areas of biology, like in ecology. The same tools are used. So we do that kind of stuff. Now, is it ideal? Absolutely not. But it is one way to proceed. And to me, to my way of looking at things, we've learned a lot more about consciousness over the last 20 or 30 years because of neuroscience and cognitive science than because of any speculation that has come out of metaphysics.
What have we learned? I mean, we've learned that subjective experiences seem very closely correlated with brain states. But aside from that, what have we learned?
Well, that's a huge one. But not only because
I could have told you that.
Well, but you couldn't have told me which brain states. You couldn't have told me.
What does that matter for philosophical purposes?
For philosophical purposes, it doesn't matter, but it matters if you want to turn the study of consciousness into a scientific one, right? I mean, what we're talking about here is, are we going to have a mechanistic explanation of the process of consciousness? And, the answer, I think, is going to be, if it's going to be yes, if it's going to be positive, and certainly nobody can say at this point, it's not going to come up from the zombies. It's going to come up from the fMRI scans. It's going to come up from all of the studies that investigate the effect of different chemicals, for instance, on degrees of consciousness. There's quite a lot there that gets pretty much shoved aside by metaphysicians who work on consciousness.
Yeah,
Well,
actually, let me quickly make a connection between this and the question of purpose and evolution, which is, I think the point of the zombie thought experiment, and actually there was a version of it in my 1988 book, Three Scientists and Their Gods. It's the same thing. I think that Chalmers is talking about, and basically I'm making the point that, if consciousness if subjective experience is, as is commonly conceived, as many people believe,
right.
And particularly people of a scientific orientation, I think their common sense kind of notion of what subjective experience is as a kind of epiphenomenon of physical processes. In other words, the physical processes kind of generate the subjective states. They influence the subjective states, but are not in turn influenced by them. If they were influenced by them, you would have Cartesian dualism, which is pretty widely rejected by people of a scientific orientation. And the point of the zombie thought experiment is that, let's suppose that this is the correct view of subjective experience, that, it's just a kind of a shadow cast by physical processes that doesn't in turn influence them. Well, if that's the case, then you have to understand, then it has no function, right? And the illustration of that is these so-called zombies, which don't have subjective experience in this thought experiment, could behave exactly as we behave. There could be a planet full of people behaving as we behave. Because remember, even what we're doing now, talking, communication is can be described as a physical process. The physical sound waves go in my ear. They trigger a bunch of stuff. That leads to sound waves coming out of my mouth. You can describe the whole system in physical terms. So in principle, if subjective experience is kind of merely epiphenomenal, then what is it for? It has no function.
Right, but I reject the idea that consciousness is epiphenomenal, and I reject the idea that it doesn't have a function. For instance, one very common kind of conscious experience is the experience of pain, and the hell that pain doesn't have causal, effects. Of course it does, because I feel pain. Right. I feel pain, and I react to it, and I do something.
Sure.
Right, I identify an area. Yeah.
But wait, if you were a true materialist, and certainly a lot of behavioral scientists would say to you, sure, it feels to you as if the feeling is what made your hand react, but we can show you that what's, quote, really going on is that there are these physical sensors at the end of your fingertips, and they feel the flame triggers something in them that starts a chain of physical reaction that goes up your arm and induces withdrawal. That's the point of the zombie experience, is that if you're a serious materialist and behavioral scientist, I mean, the zombie thought experiment, then the question, and you believe that we can explain all of human behavior in these physical terms, including withdrawing your hand from a burning flame, then the pain is superfluous. Functionally, that's the point. Now, you may say it's not, but if you're saying it's not, then you're heading into what these days is some pretty rare territory, I think, in terms of what you're saying consciousness is.
I don't think so. Any biologist would tell you that there's nothing bizarre about this at all. Pain is highly adaptive. Absolutely. Right? I mean, and it's not just human beings.
I get that that's a way of talking about it, but
what do you mean?
The point is you can describe the process at either of the two levels. You can say he withdrew his hand because he felt the pain. That's the way it felt to him. Or you can say, look, we have a completely satisfactory explanation of why he withdrew his hand without talking about the pain through the physical processes.
But we do not. That's the thing.
Well, in principle, we do. Many scientists believe that in principle you could do that. And you talk about advances in science. We're getting better and better at doing it. We understand more and more about how the physical nerves work and signals go up and down the arm.
Yes, we do. And all of that is very interesting. But no, I don't know any biologist would actually agree with that characterization. The fact of the matter is what you're talking there is two different levels of description, okay, which are not incompatible at all. The phenomenological level of description is the one at the level of which, the behavioral ecologist, for instance, works. Doesn't have to know anything at all about the molecular structure of what's going on or the molecular processes. Ecology, a lot of ecology and all of evolutionary biology is done without completely ignoring, taking the molecular part as a black box. And vice versa, a lot of molecular biology is done without any thought whatsoever for the higher level consequences of those processes. What we want, ideally, however, is bridges between these levels of analysis. I mean, what biology has been doing for the last couple of decades is trying painfully and slowly to bridge that kind of gap. But it's pretty unanimously, I think, understood among evolutionary biologists that pain is highly adaptive.
No, I have written the same thing. I've written the same thing, but it's really just a simplified way of talking. I mean, and I don't agree.
You never experienced sexual pain? I mean, I'm sure you have experienced pain.
Of course.
Right. So what do you mean is a way of talking? There is an experience there, right?
I mean, as you said, there are two parallel things going on when someone withdraws their hand from a flame. There is a sheerly physical description of the process. And I think many people who are in the business of studying the physical part would say, in principle, they can come up with a completely satisfactory explanation of why the person withdrew the hand just by describing the physical stuff.
Yes, of course.
Okay, then the subjective experience is, from an explanatory standpoint, from their point of view, superfluous. It's not
But they
needed.
haven't gone in there. That's what I'm saying is they're not even close to that. They're hinching there.
You don't think they'll get there then? You don't think they'll get there?
They might. I hope they do.
Okay, let's suppose they do. Then would you agree that the subjective experience is, from their point of view, superfluous?
No, I would simply say...
As an explanation.
No, I would simply say that the behavioral explanation is complementary and useful in different contexts from the one in which the molecular neurobiologist is working. I mean, again, I think it's a given in any introductory text in evolutionary biology that two kinds of subjective experience are fundamental in the animal world, and they're not found, as far as we can tell, in plants, and that's pleasure and pain.
I've written this myself in my most recent book on Buddhism and in the Moral Animal on Evolutionary Psychology. I understand why that's a much faster way of talking. I mean, it's a way of helping people understand why they have these feelings in a certain sense. It's not an explanation of why subjective experience exists, period.
I think it is. I think it's an explanation of why it exists from an evolutionary perspective. What it is not is a mechanistic explanation of how it exists. How is it possible? That's the bit that we're missing. We don't know how all those molecules you're talking about generate the subjective experience. That is true. That's the big lacuna that we have at the moment. But in terms of why, I think that we have those experiences because those experiences allow us to navigate better the world. We survive better as a result.
You can talk that way and it's useful to talk that way. I agree with that. But anyway, I won't keep going over and over. The question of how physical stuff might generate subjective experience is I think what the philosopher Colin McGinn called the water into wine problem. And his view, I think, is kind of like mine, which is that I wouldn't be too optimistic about our capacity to understand that as human beings. I don't know why you'd think that animals that evolve by natural selection are capable of understanding everything about the universe they're born into. After all, that's not what natural selection. Well, here we get back to the question: what did?
Right, but wait a minute. But I don't. Wait a minute, because I never said, and I definitely did not mean to imply that I think that any interesting question comes up to the human mind, it's going to have a solution, and that solution is going to be empirical. Not at all. For instance, I can give you an example of a question that I think it would never be answered by science, the origin of life on Earth. And that's not because it's particularly difficult necessarily. It's just we don't have enough information. We might even be able to recreate life under artificial conditions. Yeah. But we're not going to find out how life originated specifically on Earth 4 billion years ago for the simple reason that we don't really have anything to go by. We're not even sure of the chemical constitution of the Earth's atmosphere at the time, let alone anything else. There's no fossil record. There's nothing. So if I were to bet, that's a fairly straightforward question that is not going to get an answer scientifically.
No, but I would say it's an answer we might well be capable of understanding if we had enough evidence.
Sure.
And it's not so clear to me that questions of consciousness and free will we're especially consciousness, we're really capable of understanding.
I agree.
It's not clear to me.
I agree. It's not clear to anybody, and anybody that says we're definitely going to figure it out is a fool. However, you're asking me, how is it possible that a being that evolved by natural selection to solve survival problems, in the Pleistocene, in the savannah, is capable of solving potentially these kind of problems? I would respond to you that this same kind of being has been able to figure out the origin of the damn universe. Right. So, I mean, and certainly that wasn't a result of natural selection. It's not a natural selection, prepared for that kind of stuff.
It is amazing what we're capable of, given, and this has led to a certain amount of skepticism about whether natural selection is an adequate explanation. To some people, we seem a lot smarter than you'd need to be to be a product of natural selection. But I'll quit talking about this after this statement. But it's true that science has uncovered a huge amount. We understand a huge amount as a result of science.
Right.
But all of that science, all of that physics has been about the physical world, right? It's been about data that are publicly observable. It's like the background radiation of the universe, No one scientist has privileged access to that. You show them the data, they can all look at it. That's not true of subjective experience. I'll quit saying that, but it is qualitatively different.
Yeah, I think it. I guess we have to disagree on that one. Let me make one comment about the problem that I have with the zombies, since this has been brought up several times. So, as you know, the whole point of the thought experiment of the zombies is that it is conceivable that there might be creatures out there like you and me that behave like we're behaving, that talk, that react, and that scream, and all that sort of stuff, and yet there is nothing going on in there. Right? Mm-hmm. There's no actual conscious phenomenal experience whatsoever. So Chalmers says this is conceivable. And I say, so what? Because being conceivable is even lower than a lower standard than logical consistency. There are things that are logically inconsistent that we have conceived. For instance, in the past, for like 2,000 years, people conceived that there was going to be a solution to the problem of squaring the circle. Turns out there isn't one. It's logically impossible. So conceivability is such a low standard. It's like, sure, anything is conceivable. Literally, anything you can think about is conceivable, including things that not only couldn't exist physically, right? And I think that zombies couldn't exist physically in this universe. But even things that couldn't exist logically or mathematically, you can conceive of those things. So conceivability tells you pretty much nothing. It sounds really interesting. It sounds really deep, but it tells you actually nothing about how the world works. It only tells you something about how your mind works in terms of, imagining things.
Yeah. And I mean, I should say, I think Chalmers puts that to slightly different use than I had put it to in my book. For my money, the point was that to point out to people who have an epiphenomenal view of consciousness, that is, they think subjective experience is kind of the shadow cast by physical stuff. It is a product of the physical stuff. It's influenced by the physical stuff, but exerts no influence itself on physical stuff.
Right.
For my money, the purpose of the thought experiment is to point out to them that then what they are saying is that subjective experience is functionally superfluous, has no function, period. That's the point of the thought experiment. From my point of view, it's useful for that narrow purpose. And then, you might, having established that point, do more things with that, which ultimately I would say is not totally irrelevant to the question of whether evolution could have a purpose. On the other hand, I think we should make a decision at this point, having failed to talk about what we set out to talk about. Should we just give up and spend 20 minutes freelancing, or should we maybe revisit?
Well, you the host, ask, my friend. It's up to you.
you would ask, what would evidence
yes,
a purpose look like?
Right.
I don't think I'll get into what I've been hinting at, which is that there's a sense in which questions about consciousness could be brought into that, the consideration of what constitutes evidence of purpose, whether the existence of consciousness constitutes evidence of purpose. Let's leave that aside. I would say that one thing you would expect, well, there's a couple of things. Where should we go? Let me first. Maybe we should.
Well, one thing that
you might expect of any purposive system, is that it tends to go somewhere. Right? Sure. I mean, it in some sense has a direction. I mean, a thermostat carries the temperature toward the setting that the thermostat is at. For example, goal-oriented systems move in some sense toward a goal.
Right.
So if your hypothesis were that the purpose of evolution was to create life intelligent enough, well, at least as intelligent as us, a life that could launch a second kind of evolution, technological evolution, cultural evolution more broadly, which then could do some other things that we needn't get into. But suppose that's the goal, or suppose that's at least a goal subordinate to the larger goal. Suppose that the person who designed the simulation, or the alien that tinkered with the base pairs in designing, in setting natural selection in motion, wanted intelligent life to transpire, and then that is at least either the goal or the first or one in a series of goals or something. Well, if that's the hypothesis, then it would help to be able to argue that natural selection was likely to produce intelligent life. That's not an easy argument to settle, but it's something you can argue about, right? It's like you can adduce evidence.
Yeah, you can argue about it. There's a couple of reasons for skepticism, I guess, from my perspective. Actually, three, I guess. Number one, you can actually come up with examples of systems that change in a determinate direction over time, and I don't think we would think of those systems as intelligently designed or having a purpose. For instance, beginning with the universe itself, it goes toward higher and higher entropy, and yet, that directionality is pretty well established. It's been going on for 12, 13 billion years. It probably will go on until the end of, the terminal death of the universe. And yet, I doubt that anybody would seriously say, oh yeah, there's a purpose because, that you can evince from that, right? So that's one kind of objection. That is, yes, I would agree with you that purposive systems tend towards certain goals, but unfortunately, we can also see a lot of things that appear to be goals and they're not actually goals at all. Mm-hmm. The second type of objection is that we actually have, the obvious things that has happened on the biosphere, on the the Earth biosphere, is that it has increased complexity. So you could say, well, that maybe that's the purpose, or maybe that is evidence of purpose. However, there is also a very straightforward argument that, well, of course it evolved toward greater complexity because it had to start simple. It had to start the simplest possible living organism, whatever that turned out to be. And so there was nowhere to go there other than more complex. It's like the analogy here would be that of a random walk starting in a particular point, right? Mm-hmm. If you start a random walk in a particular point, you're actually likely to go into a certain direction, what appears to be a certain direction. But that's actually entirely random. It's not because there is any purpose behind the whole thing. So increased complexity kind of had to happen once you start in competition within the biosphere. And also, let's not forget that we're looking at it from the point of view, we're looking at the question from the point of view of highly complex organisms ourselves, and we think that we're so special and so cool. And, to some extent we are.
Hey, Massimo, I have news for you. We are.
To some extent we are. But the fact remains that for the overwhelming majority of life on Earth, there were no complex life forms. There were only bacteria. And the fact also remains that bacteria still today are by far the most successful living organism on the planet in terms of biomass.
Aren't all organisms equally successful? They all reproduce.
Well, if you're talking about in terms of biomass, bacteria way overwhelm anything else.
You give me a choice between a brain and biomass, and I'll take a brain. But you
can
choose whatever you want.
So, look, I'm not saying that there is nothing special, as in unusual, about human beings. Absolutely. And of course, to us, that's very precious. But to make that into, the whole shebang was set up so that we could come by, it's like, Also, there's no guarantee. We have no idea whether the evolution of I don't even want to say the human species, but even an complex intelligent species was necessarily, into the cards. I mean, we don't, Unfortunately, we have an experiment of, sample size of n equal 1, right? Now, the moment in which
not exactly, but go ahead.
Well,
I mean, we only have one ecosystem that evolved in our experience.
Right. That's true. That's what I mean. And so now, should we in the distant future discover different ecosystems? And it turns out that, guess what? Every time you find an ecosystem, you also find after a certain period of time, intelligent, complex life forms. Then I'm going to start to say, all right, then there is something that might be inevitable. But even inevitable doesn't mean, again, still purposive. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. Now, as you probably know, there's a distinction that philosophers make that might be helpful in this discussion, and that is between teleonomy and teleology. Right?
Yeah. Go ahead and get into that. I wondered if we should get into that. In other words, teleonomy. In other words, biologists are comfortable saying, yes, animals have goal orientation.
Right.
They refer to that as teleonomy.
Correct.
Whereas they want to say that, but if there's something that's designed like a computer, designed to do something, because it was designed by an intelligent being,
right?
They want to use a different term for that, even though both have functionality and goal orientation, right? They want to call that teleology. Is that
teleology? And the reason for that choice first is important. For that word is important. First of all, it's the word that Aristotle used, but he used it for a particular reason. Teleology has logos into the root, so it has intelligence, right? It has some kind of. Well, teleonomy refers to a mechanistic process, right? So yes, biologists have absolutely no problem saying yes. Of course, the human eye, let's say, has a purpose. Meaning it has a function that has been shaped by a natural process, of natural selection.
Right.
But it's not teleological, because if you're saying it was teleological, then you're saying essentially it was intelligently designed, not necessarily by a god. We agreed before that, at the beginning of this discussion, that it's certainly conceivable that we are, it is a logical possibility that we actually are the result of an experiment made, started out by intelligent extraterrestrials, in which case, however, we would be talking about intelligent design, not divine intelligent design,
Yeah,
but intelligent design nonetheless.
I'm almost reluctant to use that term because it's become so associated with a particular
I know, it's loaded. Yeah.
non-Darwinian view of evolution. But but let me say, I want to take this opportunity to say that in my view, okay, so first of all, some philosophers are more finicky than others about how they use the word purpose. Like
sure.
Dan Dennett, who certainly doesn't agree with me about all this stuff, does agree you can talk about animals as having purposes.
Right.
To get genes into the next generation, such subordinate purposes as eating, which facilitates getting genes in the next generation. He's happy to talk that way, even though, so far as we know, the animals were just produced by natural selection, not by a conscious designer.
Right.
Other people are uncomfortable with using the word purpose to describe a goal-oriented system that's not produced by a conscious designer.
Correct. I fall in the second category. I'm not comfortable.
You do, and that's why you want to distinguish between teleology and teleonomy, which is okay. It's a question of nomenclature. What I do sometimes is say that, when we talk about animals having purposes, I would put purpose in quotation marks.
Sure.
Because it's kind of an analogy, But the point is that in principle, physical systems can have goal orientation and what it's fair to call functionality, either as a result of being hands-on designed by an intelligent being, like a computer, a clock,
right.
or, and the only example we have of this, I guess, is natural selection,
right.
as a result of a blind kind of process of design. Okay, so we agree on that. And
those are the only two categories that we recognize, because if you go outside of that, then we're talking theology.
And what I want to say, one thing I want to just say in that context, and I'm not sure, having read your reply to my New York Times piece, exactly how open to this you are, skeptical of it, or how much you do or don't like the language. In principle, it is possible. If there is in some sense a larger purpose unfolding through evolution, it could be purpose in quotes. In other words, it's logically possible, which I know doesn't count much with you, but it's logically possible that natural selection could itself be an algorithm that was designed by a kind of a blind process, a kind of meta-natural selection. And the example of this I've used is if you take Lee Smolin's idea of cosmological natural selection, where universes actually give birth to other universes. It's of course very conjectural, even by his own acknowledgement. But he would say maybe that explains why there's so many black holes. Maybe universes give birth through black holes. So through this process of selection, universes with lots of black holes are favored, just as highly fertile organisms are favored through natural selection. Yeah. You can tweak that, and I've talked to him about this, and I've talked to people who've done the tweaking. You can tweak that scenario to come up with, again, super conjectural, but a scenario where intelligent life in the universes facilitates the replication of the universe. Here we're getting very Star Trek-y, but if that were the case, then you could imagine natural selection among universes tending to favor universes that were likely to produce a process of evolution that was likely to produce intelligent life. That's conceivable, I think. Do you agree that it's at least conceivable?
Let me qualify that agreement. Again, yeah, conceivable, sure. Yeah, because as I said, conceivability is even lower than logical necessity. So logical coherence. So sure, everything is conceivable pretty much. As long as we're talking about it, means that it's conceivable. If you're saying something to me and I think I understand what you're saying, that means it's conceivable. However, that said.
Thanks for that compliment.
Well, it was a backhanded compliment. No, but that seriously, that said, however, the issue that I have is actually with Lee Smolin's cosmological natural selection. In fact, I actually wrote a separate rebuttal to him. And at some point we were supposed to have a dialogue together about it, and then it didn't happen. I would grant you this, from the argument you just made is like, yes, if we knew of a meta process, so to speak, right, that itself generated natural selection, then yes, then we get it somewhere, right? My objection, of course, is that at least at the moment, as far as I know, there is no such thing as that kind of meta process. Now, the only candidate, again, I agree with you, that I know of at least, is Smolin's cosmological natural selection. The problem is that I wish he hadn't used that term, because I think he's under some kind of misconception, which is not necessarily a fault for a physicist, about what natural selection actually is and how it works. Because when he says that natural selection would favor universes with a certain characteristic or another, he's forgetting a couple of things. There are two crucial elements that are necessary for natural selection to actually work. One is an inheritance system. And if there is no inheritance system, and as far as we know, there is no inheritance system in what he's talking about. He does speculate that the laws of nature are somehow inherited and they can be mutated, one way or another into a second universe. But that's entirely conjecture. There's no reason at all to believe that that is the case, as opposed to real natural selection, where we do know quite a bit about the genetic inheritance system. The other one is natural selection also requires competition. It happens because there is competition for limited resources. And it's not clear to me at all what the limited resources would be in the case of budding universes. Where are these resources? What is it that limits the growth of these universes? It seems to me, from the little I understand about the physics, that a budding universe just creates its own space. And there is no limitation of resources. So failing a reasonable answer to both, not just one, but both of these, I think that Smolin's mechanism of cosmic natural selection is incoherent from the point of view of a biologist. I understand why he's doing that. And that he's, as you know, he's really getting up against a real problem, which is the problem of fine-tuning of the laws of nature and the constants of nature, right? Which is a problem that other people have come up with different solutions. The multiverse is another solution. He doesn't like that, and I think he's right in not liking that solution. Because that kind of solution basically postulates, which is popular among some cosmologists like Shankara. The multiverse basically says, look, all possible universes exist, and so there's no problem to figure out why is it that a tiny fraction of those universes have the precise combination of laws of nature and natural constants that allow life to evolve, et cetera, et cetera. Fine. The problem is there is no empirical evidence whatsoever about the existence of multiple universes. And Smolin is right in criticizing the multiverse hypothesis on that ground. Unfortunately, he falls into the same kind of problem because there is no evidence whatsoever of budding universes, cosmic natural selection, and things like that. Quite frankly, it seems to me that the problem of fine-tuning is a problem, and we need to face the fact that really might be one of those problems that you were mentioning earlier that might not be smart enough to figure out. And as you know, I'm not tempted for even a second to go for the theological answer and say, well, the universe is designed this way because there is a creator God. That's another non-starter for very similar reasons. It's like, okay, but I have no idea. That's just all three of those, as far as I can tell, are, meaning the theological answer, the multiverse, and Smolin's natural cosmological selection. All three are ad hoc answers made up in order to arrive at some kind of solutions for this problem of fine-tuning. Which brings me to actually the point at the end, the very end of your article in New York Times, where I completely agree with you. If I remember correctly, I reread it recently, so I should remember correctly, that you said basically that notions like the simulation hypothesis, things like that, are essentially the secular equivalent of the religious belief that there is a creator God, right? And I completely agree. They are in fact the same exact thing. Just like in my mind, at least, the notion of uploading consciousness is the secular equivalent of the rapture. We want immortality. We want meaning. We want this, some kind of broader thing that makes sense of what we are. And they are misguided for the same reason as the theological ones. That's what I would want to say. I think that as secular people, we should just stay away from that and say, look, we don't have an answer. We don't know. We have no idea why this stuff is out there. At the moment, either it is not possible in principle for human beings to come up with those answers, or no equivalent of Einstein, Galileo, or Darwin as yet been born that can tackle those kind of answers. And so it's like, I think it's a matter of humility. And at some point you can say, okay, we really have no idea. We can speculate over a glass of wine, especially. I love to speculate about these things, but let's not take those things, those speculations, as actual reasonable, grounded hypotheses that we can pursue in any way. They are what they are. They're just speculations.
Yeah, my main point with the simulation thing is it's just kind of ironic that there are people who consider themselves like highly secular and would laugh at religious people and then say, hey, the simulation thing is interesting. And it's like, wait, that's just deism. That is a theology, okay?
Exactly.
Anyway, let me quickly, we should probably wrap up before too long. Let me touch on several things you brought up. Going back to your, I said, well, maybe if your hypothesis were that one of the goals of one of the purposes of evolution was to create intelligent life, which then might go on to create things that are also part of the larger purpose. But for starters, you'd want to be able to argue that the evolution of intelligent life was likely, and certainly any evidence you could adduce or persuasive argument you could adduce to that effect would work in favor of your hypothesis in some sense. And you said a couple of things. First of all, you said, look, there's a lot of not very smart, not very complex things like bacteria. They're doing just fine. Well, that's true. But remember, in this scenario, the goal would just be to produce at least one intelligent species. You only need one in this scenario, right? So the question wouldn't be, do all lineages get inevitably more complex? The answer to that is no. All lineages have gotten more complex. Bacteria are more complex than some of their ancestors, but that's not the point or the question. I think in the scenario where intelligent life is a purpose, all you want to be able to show is that there's a strong tendency for kind of the outer envelope of complexity and intelligence in the ecosystem to rise. In other words, if you ask, after 10 million years of evolution, what's the most complex form of life on the planet? Okay, it's this species. Then you come back in 100 million years, and then in 1 billion years, and keep asking the same question. If it is the case that the most complex and or most intelligent species each time is more complex and intelligent than it was last time you asked that question, then you could say there is a tendency for the outer envelope of complexity and intelligence to rise, which I think there manifestly is. Now, you were kind of dismissive of this fact by saying, well, of course complexity grows. Things can't get into negative complexity, right? Things can only get, in other words, the baseline, once you start off with whatever, some simple strand of DNA, well, can't get much less complex. The only place to go is upward. That's an argument made by Stephen Gould, for comparable, purposes, I think, to be dismissive of, purposive scenarios, of teleological scenarios. And I address that there's a chapter in my book, Nonzero, called Why is Life So Complex? And I make a couple of points. First of all, I would say, even if that's the only reason life gets more complex, that would be consistent with the purpose scenario. Maybe this alien sat down and said, hey, you realize if you just start natural selection off, things will inevitably get more complex because complexity has to head upward or something, whatever. Right. That could be part of a purpose, but what I want to add is that is clearly not the only reason things have gotten more complex and more.
No, I agree. I agree.
So Gould neglects this. You're very complimentary of his book Full House. I don't understand why, because what he did in that argument is very characteristic of Gould, which is, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I think he's been dead long enough to say, whatever. Anyway, he didn't do a good job of addressing the question because, look, obviously you have arms races.
Exactly.
You have arms races between species, so that the predator gets more complex, the prey gets more complex, and so on. You have arms races within species. The cleverer members do a better job of reproducing, so the average level of intelligence within the species gets higher.
Correct.
There's a lot, and there are other
this
reasons.
Is all correct.
What's that?
But that is all correct. I completely agree. In fact, when you were talking, I was thinking, but there are arms races. That's the second major reason why we get more and more complex, and in certain branches of the life of the tree of life, more intelligent beings. Not all of them, right? I mean, plants don't get more intelligent, but they do get more complex. Also, as a result of arms races.
What do we know? I mean.
No, let's not get there. Okay, so
what I'm going to say is they develop great behavioral complexity sometimes, and that's what we associate. That is the outward manifestation of what we think of as intelligence, in a way. But go ahead.
Right, but without getting but then again, we will have to make a distinction between intelligence and then intelligence with the scare quotes, because
I'm happy to confine the discussion to animals.
So let's talk about animals. Absolutely, there is arms race. Now, this is not about Gould, but if we wanted to be charitable to Gould, he certainly knew about arms races. That's
actually not being charitable about him, because it raises the question of why he did not mention them.
Because his focus in that particular book, Full House, was about stochastic processes. But regardless, forget Gould for a minute. The fact is, I think we can agree that two major sources of explanation of increasing complexity and intelligence are random walks. As you said before, you can't get any simpler than a certain level.
Right.
And especially after a certain amount of period of evolution in the early Earth, the arms races. And that's one of the reasons probably why we see bursts of increasing complexity. Like the origin of the first multicellular organism, for instance, was a burst of complexity all of a sudden. Geologically speaking, all of a sudden, not literally from one day to another. The origin of metazoans, of what we call animals, was another burst. Suddenly we have all these variety of forms, and so on and so forth. So now you can say, well, those two things are compatible with the speculation, with the notion that an intelligent life, group of extraterrestrials started all this as an experiment. Sure, it's compatible. But as Simon de Laplace famously said to Napoleon, we don't need that hypothesis, right? It's an extra thing that we're going to add there. All we need in terms of explaining the actual degree of complexity on Earth is a combination of random walks and, initial starting conditions, random walks, and especially the arms race, the repeated arms race. We don't need the extraterrestrials. Now, if we had any positive evidence that there were extraterrestrials out there that did this thing, then it would be a completely different kind of discussion.
No,
right?
I'm making a slightly different argument. You're right that the extraterrestrials, if they started natural selection, would exist at just a different level of explanation. It's just a level of explanation. It's like saying, I understand everything about the way my car works. I'm an expert. I understand the whole system, and I don't need to know who designed the car. Now, in that case, there is an answer to the question, who designed the car, but I don't need to know. As you said, you don't need that hypothesis for certain purposes. Now, as I said earlier, I think there's some questions that are so interesting: consciousness, free will, is there a larger purpose? They're just so interesting to people. I'm personally willing to tackle them, even though I don't think they will ever be scientifically resolved. Having said that, I would say that what the point I'm making here is there is kind of a form of scientific argumentation I'm trying to invoke, which is this: if your hypothesis is natural selection's purpose was to create intelligent life, then it seems to me the next level of inquiry would be to say, well, is natural selection just by virtue of its nature likely to create intelligent life? Because if it's not likely, then I think that's bad for your hypothesis that that's its purpose. If it took a series of incredibly lucky accidents on this particular planet for intelligent life to evolve, but natural selection doesn't really have any kind of inherent tendency to move toward intelligence, then that's actually bad for your hypothesis that evolution has a larger purpose. Now, to the extent that you can invoke reasons to believe that actually it was pretty likely there's some pretty stubborn tendencies favoring the evolution of intelligence, then so much the better for your hypothesis. So I see this question of like, well, is it just the random walk, or are there arms races and so on, as having at least some kind of place in an argument about whether evolution has a purpose. Now, it's far from determinative. Like I said, I don't think you'll ever resolve the question scientifically, but if somebody like me says, I think maybe the purpose of natural selection is to create intelligent life, the first thing you should say is, well, show me that it was likely to happen. Show me that it's actually a property of natural selection in and of itself to tend in these directions. I think you can make those arguments.
But we come to full circle and say, I understand what you're saying, but we come full circle when we're saying, so even let me grant you that somehow we can figure out, because we discovered different biospheres throughout the galaxy, and we found out that, hey, guess what? Every time the natural selection starts working, it inevitably creates intelligence, right? It needs intelligence. That tells me nothing about purpose, because by the same token, you can say any natural physical system will tend to, if left to its own devices, will tend to increase entropy. That doesn't mean that high entropy is the purpose of that system. It just means that that's what happens in physical systems.
It doesn't mean it. Right. But it does, it is more consistent with the hypothesis than would be the case if you could show that natural selection doesn't tend to move toward intelligence, and it was just an incredible series of flukes. Remember, this is Gould's argument. He first made it in the book on the Burgess Shale. And I gave him I wrote a scathing review of that in the New Republic, because again, it was an incredibly shoddy argument. He was arguing that for our species to evolve took an incredibly series of lucky breaks. Well, of course it did, but that's not the question. The question is, how likely was it that one intelligent species would eventually emerge? Of course, our species could have been wiped out. I mean, the Neanderthals seem to have been largely wiped out, although we now realize that we have some of their DNA. But, on the other hand, if they were wiped out by us, then, then had we not been around, maybe they would have become the intelligent species.
Fine. But let's set aside Gould for a minute, because again, I'm not defending Gould in particular. We're trying to make a more general argument here. I still don't think that that your conclusion about natural selection follows.
It doesn't follow, no.
Or even is actually a reasonable way to think about it when you compare it with the counterexample of entropy. So would you say, for instance, that if I understand your reasoning correctly, you would be saying essentially something analogous to the purpose of the second principle thermodynamics is to increase entropy? That would seem like
no, I would never say that.
Well, but you're saying something equivalent. You're saying the purpose, you're thinking that the purpose of natural selection is to yield complexity, right?
I'm saying it's a possibility that we should take more seriously.
Right, but what is the difference between the two cases?
I haven't given all my reasons for thinking it should be taken seriously.
Fair enough.
But it is, and I'm just saying, like, I think you'd agree. Like, if I said, I think the purpose of evolution was to create intelligence, and you say, wait a second, I've got bad news for you. We have a way of simulating natural selection in these computers. We're starting with natural selection, and look, you can see in all of these simulations, it doesn't create intelligence. So it actually wasn't likely. It was a fluke. I think you would say, so your hypothesis of purpose looks worse now, deserves less credence now that I've shown you how unlikely the evolution of intelligence was than it did before. Well, by the same token, if I could show you that actually intelligence was a likely product of natural selection, my hypothesis would, relatively speaking, look better, deserve more credence
I
than if
understand.
we had concluded that intelligence wasn't likely. Look, it's a simple point I'm making, but...
Right, no, I understand, but I think that actually whether natural selection always leads to intelligence or not is actually irrelevant. I don't think it helps you at all. For the same reasons, again, that we have physical processes that always invariably lead to a particular outcome, and nobody would ever think about talking of those processes in terms of purpose.
You're talking about physical laws?
Yeah. Second principle of thermodynamics.
I just don't consider that an analogy.
Why not? Natural selection is a physical process, right?
But
it's a natural process.
It's not a law of physics. It's not a law of physics.
Well, some biologists might actually disagree. It's not a law of physics, but it is a natural process that works in similar ways.
It's a product of physical processes, including physical laws.
But what are physical laws, then, I'd have to say? I mean, physical laws are just, just our way to conceptualize empirical generalizations, right? So we know that entropy in open systems increases no matter what over time. And we call that the second law of thermodynamics. We know that...
Okay, but here's the difference. If you say, was the purpose of the second law of thermodynamics to create entropy?
Right.
It's not like... It is part of the definition of the second law of thermodynamics that it creates entropy. It is not part of the definition of natural selection that it produces intelligence. You can imagine a process of genetic replication with random mutation that just never creates anything as smart as a human being, no matter how long you give it. That's what Gould thought was the case.
I'm not so sure that it's part of the definition of the second law that it creates entropy. I mean, that's an empirical finding. That entropy increases in the universe is an empirical finding. No,
that's what the second law says.
Yeah, I know, but it's a description of that empirical finding. That's what I'm saying. Therefore, one can make the same reasoning in terms of natural selection. If you discovered that natural selection invariably leads to intelligence, then one would say, okay, well then natural selection is that process that, given certain conditions, will lead to intelligence.
If I defined it that way, but that's not the definition of natural selection. It's just genetic, it's just a variation, it's just the replication of these inherited traits with some variation. That's what natural selection is. And it's not inherent in that definition of it that it produced things as smart as us. Yet it did, which is kind of amazing. I think it's an interesting question. Did that require a series of bizarre flukes? Or is it the case that if you unleash it on a planet and give it 5 billion years and the planet doesn't get hit by an asteroid or something, there's a pretty good chance that you'll get intelligence? To me, that's an interesting question.
It is definitely an interesting question.
But it's very different from the second law of thermodynamics, which literally cannot help but produce entropy.
Yeah, but it's the reason what I'm saying is the reason I brought up the analogy is because the only reason currently those two things are different is because we don't know what is the necessary outcome of the natural selective process, right? We don't know because we only have one biosphere, as we agreed before.
Right.
Right? So it's an open empirical question. The physicists in this sense are ahead of the biologists. The reason why natural selection is not a law of nature is because, so far as we know, it only happened on one planet. Right? Now, however, it could have happened everywhere in the universe as far as we know. We have no idea, right? And so should it in fact happen, if we discover that natural selection happens in everywhere there are the conditions that generate life, and should we discover that every time that it happens, it leads to complexity, or it leads to intelligence, or to both, then at that point you start elevating natural selection to the level of natural law.
Okay, but even though we only have one ecosystem to observe, there's still other questions you can ask beyond the ones we've asked, and we can't,
Sure.
We've been talking a long time, but I would just say an example is the multiple independent invention of the same thing. Like if you said, was winged flight likely to evolve by natural selection? Well, if it had only evolved once, you might say maybe not, but we know it's evolved multiple times. Multicellular life evolved independently multiple times. Okay. This really complicated kind of eyeball we have evolved independently in octopuses and so on. Yep. That's another kind of question you can ask about how likely properties were. So, are there a number of different lineages in which you can chart a growth of intelligence? I think there are, and so on. You can, so there are questions you can ask, even within an ecosystem, that are relevant to the larger question.
And multiple evolution of the same traits under similar conditions is a well-established phenomenon. I mean,
right.
There's no question about it. But again, why on earth would we need to bring in the word purpose in there? All we need to say is the natural selection, which is a process we understand fairly well, under certain conditions lead to the evolution and under certain constraints. Because, for instance, one of the best examples of what you're talking about, the parallel evolution, as it's called, of the same kind of structure, is the evolution of highly fusiform bodies in animals that swim fast, right?
Right.
We got the dolphins that came from mammals. We got fish, different kinds of fish, cartilaginous fish, bony fish, and so on and so forth. All of those evolved these, and in fact, even some invertebrates evolved these very fusiform bodies. Now one can say, well, isn't that strange? And the answer there is, well, no, it's not strange. It's a result of natural selection that creates the variety and the competition, etc. And the fact that all these animals had the same problem to solve. I need to move fast in a medium like water that has certain mechanical characteristics and so on and so forth. And it turns out that from an engineering perspective, so to speak, and I'm using the word in quotation marks here, that's one of the best solutions. And so it evolved several times. But that is not surprising. I mean, all of that means
no, it's not. That's my point. It follows from the logic of natural selection that you're likely to get certain things, including intelligence. What is intelligence? It's behavioral flexibility. And you can see why behavioral flexibility is so useful in evolution. So intelligence, in the sense at least of more and more intelligence, is a likely product of natural selection. Again, and you say, well, you don't have to, why would you invoke purpose? You don't have to invoke purpose. But my point is, if you start off with the hypothesis of purpose, there are challenges you can subject that hypothesis to. You can say, but wait a second. Maybe multicellular life wasn't likely to evolve. Well, you can actually show that's wrong. Or at least, arguably wrong, given the number of times it evolved, and so on. So when it turns out that these things have evolved independently, things like behavioral flexibility, which is kind of tantamount to intelligence itself, that is, whether you want to think of it as something that corroborates the hypothesis of purpose or just a challenge that the hypothesis has survived, I'm just saying it's relevant to the question of purpose.
Yeah, and I think that really boils down to where our disagreement is. I don't actually think that those observations help the hypothesis at all, for the simple reason that, yes, those are things that are predicted by the hypothesis. You're absolutely right. If you start with the notion that, look, my hypothesis predicts that if natural selection has purpose, it should produce intelligence or complexity. Right? Great. Fine. Then if you discover that, in fact, natural selection does not produce intelligence or complexity on a regular basis, then the hypothesis is in trouble. However, the problem is that natural selection without purpose also can be thought of as producing intelligence and complexity, and therefore we're still at the same problem where adding the purpose on top of it without additional, external evidence, like, an intelligent race of extraterrestrials, doesn't really help. Basically, what you have is what philosophers call an underdetermination of the theory by the data. The data cannot discriminate between natural selection as simple as the process as we understand it today and natural selection with purpose.
Okay, first of all, I want to really dwell on something you said. The hypothesis of purpose makes predictions. They can be tested. It can pass these tests or fail. And you agree that in the couple of cases I've mentioned, it passes the test. I mean, I'd be willing to stop here. I'm delighted to hear you put it that way because I agree that's the way to put it. Now, when you say, but we don't need the hypothesis of purpose, for many reasons we don't. Again, it's kind of like figuring out what consciousness is. We don't need to do it. But I would say that if the question is, how did natural selection get started? Where did natural selection come from? If you're talking about that question, you don't have an answer to that question. So
neither do you. I mean,
well, but purpose would be a category of answers, right? If there's purpose, then you would say, well, then either like an intelligent being created it, or a process of meta-natural selection created it.
But then again, I'm going back to my analogy with physics. We don't have an answer to the question of why the second principle of thermodynamics works.
We don't have an answer, but that's a different question. I would say go back to the question of fine-tuning, the so-called fine-tuning, like if the physical constants were just a little different, then the universe would collapse or something. Right. And lo and behold, the universe seems to have almost been tailor-made for stability or something. We don't know what the answer is to that question. But as you said, there are several hypotheses. I think they're worth entertaining. We don't know. Yeah,
and again, that boils it down to another difference, that I think that those hypotheses are worth entertaining as a conversational thing, as like the two of us are doing. Yeah. I don't think, however, lots of people want to raise them to the level of scientific hypotheses, and they're not, because there is no way that we can conceive at the moment, at least, to actually bring empirical evidence to bear on those hypotheses, in which case they're just speculation. And I would like to keep a distinction between science and speculation. That's basically one of the
Okay, but you agree that this particular speculative hypothesis is subject to at least some of the kind of testing scientific hypotheses are subject to.
Yeah, but the thing is,
okay,
you seem to think,
gotta stop you. Yeah, didn't hear the but. Sorry, gotta run.
Yeah, we should probably leave it there.
No, go ahead and finish, and then we will.
No. All I was saying is that there are just because a hypothesis predicts certain things that could potentially be falsified by the data. Right? That doesn't really mean that we made a lot of progress, because unfortunately the scenario we see is not the one that will falsify the hypothesis. Right? So as we said a minute ago, the problem is that the hypothesis that natural selection it's a natural process, period, or the hypothesis that natural selection requires some kind of purpose or embeds some kind of purpose. Those are the two hypotheses, right? And the problem is that those hypotheses seem to be making at the moment exactly the same prediction.
Whoa.
Complexity evolves and intelligence evolves.
I want to emphasize that if there's anything I want to drive home here, it's that those are not competing hypotheses. If the hypothesis of purpose turns out to be true, natural selection will still be the explanation of how evolution works. I wouldn't expect anything different about evolution beyond the kind of basic Darwinian mechanics as a result of the if the hypothesis of purpose is true. That's really a fundamental thing to understand.
I understand that.
That's how I started out. That's how I started out.
I understand that part.
People say, wait, I thought you were a Darwinian.
But they're still different
Well, they're
hypotheses,
different,
right?
but they're compatible. That's my point.
Yeah, and my point is they're not discernible. That the compatibility is so high that you cannot actually tell. In which case, what you're left with is a simple case of Occam's razor. You're left with hypothesis number one that says one thing, and then hypothesis number two that says the same thing plus another thing. And since they have exactly the same explanatory power, why the hell would you want to go to one thing plus another? That's basically the objection.
There's a second sense in which they're not competing hypotheses, okay? I mean, as I said, they're not competing in the sense that they're compatible, but they're not trying to explain the same thing. Purpose, if it turns out to be true, would explain how natural selection got started on the planet. That's a different question from why animals, how they evolved the properties they have. So it's not like these two, they're not competing hypotheses.
But then if they're not competing hypotheses, how would you tell them apart? Right? So you're trying to answer...
Again...
You're trying to answer a meta question.
What?
You're trying to answer a meta question. How did natural selection get started?
Mm-hmm.
Is that where we're going at this point?
Well, if the hypothesis of purpose is true, that tells you at least that there was something before it that would shed light on how it came to be on this planet. Yes.
Right. Well, the current view, as far as I can tell, among evolutionary biologists, on the other hand, and actually computational scientists these days, is that natural selection simply is essentially a law of nature, although nobody calls it that. But it's a law of nature that is triggered by certain conditions. So once you have certain physical or, in fact, not even physical systems, because it works inside computers as well, right? So once you have certain systems that have certain characteristics, such as reproduction, a limited amount of resources, and a system of inheritance, then natural selection is what comes into, what describes the behavior of those systems. And therefore, in a sense, there's no really question of where does natural selection come from. That's what it is. Natural selection is what happens when these systems come into existence, right? Yeah.
But it has to start with this self-replicating information. And so far as we know, that doesn't exist on any other planet. So it's kind of interesting. How did it come to be here?
Yeah, absolutely. But when you say so far as we know it doesn't exist on other planets, that's literally because we haven't been to other planets. We don't know whether it exists or not. It's very possible that we get to Titan, we discover life there, or Mars, and we discover life there, and we find out, oh, that's how it comes about.
Yeah, my point is just that I wouldn't take it for granted. The seeds of natural selection, I mean, especially given the second law of thermodynamics in a way, are not to be kind of taken for granted, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
But we you know, you're I think in New York the competition for bandwidth, speaking of competition for resources, is starting to kick in because you've been freezing up a little, so maybe we should call it a day. Call it
a night. Yes.
Covered a lot of ground. Thank you. Let me quickly say, if people want to see the closest thing I've done to an actual written argument that there is evidence of purpose, I would first go to that New York Times piece, Could Evolution Have a Higher Purpose, by me. And then near the bottom, there's a link to a piece that's actually on the meaningoflife.tv site that I wrote. That's the longer version of this. But anyway, thank you for indulging me, Massimo.
And likewise. This was a lot of fun.
It was fun. Where can people find you on Twitter and stuff?
They can find me at M. Pigliucci, MPIGLIUCCI. And then all my writings, podcasts, including these videos and everything, can be found at massimopigliucci.com.
Okay, great. And are there other books you wanna mention besides How to Be a Stoic? Although that's certainly recommended for people who wanna.
Thank you.
Endure the current era of history.
Right, I know, right? You can't believe how many requests for interviews on Stoicism I got during the pandemic. Yes, there is a new book that just came out recently. It's called The Field Guide to a Happy Life, and it is about Stoicism. It is, however, about bringing up Stoicism to date to the 21st century, because as you know, Stoicism, started out 24 centuries ago. And there are a few things here and there that we discovered, both in terms of science and in terms of philosophy, that I think require a little bit of an update. So just in the way in which people write about, modern Buddhism as opposed to the early variation, then in A Field Guide to a Happy Life, I present the modern version of Stoicism for the 21st century.
Hey, speaking of which, a mutual plug, if people want to search for our names on YouTube and the words Buddhism and Stoicism, we had a long conversation about the parallels and contrasts, which...
that was fun as well. I keep using it with my students,
Yeah. So I hope we'll have a chance to come back and either continue this conversation or figure out something else to argue about.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks,
and one of these days on an actual, in person with a glass of wine would be nice.
Well, the scientists tell us that will be possible, possibly within 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, so let's hope.
To do safely. All right. I look forward to it.
Stay safe.
Okay. Take care.